The mud of Pine Creek Ranch was a living thing. It was a slick, clinging clay that could swallow a rubber boot in seconds, and it had claimed many vehicles over the decades. Today, it was challenging Brad Larson, and Brad was confident he would win. He sat high in the pristine, temperature-controlled cab of his brand-new Caterpillar 320 Excavator, a machine that still had that rich, new heavy machinery smell. Brad had nicknamed it the Hulk. It was a marvel of modern engineering, $400,000 of steel, hydraulic power, and laser-guided precision, a shining beacon of orange and black against the rugged, rain-soaked landscape of the Pacific Northwest. He had come from out of state with big plans for this property, to turn it into high-profit cattle pasture land, and the Hulk was the key to unlocking its potential. There was only one obstacle left standing in his way: the Sentinel. That was the name the locals had given to the ancient, weathered Douglas fir stump that dominated the edge of the low field. The Sentinel was more than a stump. It was a legend. Decades of weathering had turned its wood into something akin to petrified stone, with deep, twisted roots that spread out like an underground fortress. Every owner of the ranch for the last 60 years had tried and failed to remove it. Some had used dynamite only to blow off the top few feet. Others had used a series of older machines, leaving broken chains and hydraulic fluid behind. Brad knew the stories. He'd heard them over beers at the local tavern, where the old ranchers, men who looked as weathered as the stump itself, would nod and say, "That old girl won't budge for no machine." Brad had just smirked into his glass. That was then. This was now. He was a modern man with a modern machine. This afternoon, the Sentinel would be a pile of firewood. He started the massive cat engine, a rich, deep rumble that felt satisfyingly powerful. With practiced ease, he maneuvered the 22-ton beast toward the stump. He had spent the previous 2 days digging around the thing, exposing the upper few feet of the massive, dark root network. Today was for extraction. He intended to proceed methodically, but with a display of pure force that would impress any onlooker, even if the only onlookers were the distant Cascade Mountains. "All right, Sentinel," Brad murmured into the clean air of his cab. "Time to move along." He lowered the massive 1.2 cubic yard bucket, utilizing the auxiliary hydraulic thumb, a $15,000 add-on, to grip the thickest visible taproot on the eastern side. He applied gentle pressure. The Cat 320 groaned, the hydraulic lines tensing. Brad could feel the feedback through the joysticks. The root, dark with oil and earth, held fast. He increased the pressure, the engine tone deepening. The machine shifted slightly on its tracks, digging deeper into the mud. He tried to wiggle the root, hoping to crack it loose. Pop! A sickeningly familiar sound echoed, but it wasn't the root. One of the hardened bucket teeth had snapped, sheared off by the density of the wood. Brad cursed under his breath. He'd have to get that replaced. Still, he wasn't worried. This was just a warm-up. He readjusted his approach. He drove the bucket tip deeper under the central structure of the stump, trying to use leverage from below while simultaneously gripping the top. He applied upward pressure. The excavator pitched backward slightly, its tracks lifting an inch out of the clay. "Come on, you stubborn bastard," Brad urged, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. He pushed the Cat to its limits. He cycled the hydraulic functions rapidly, trying to work the stump from different angles. He pushed with the arm and pulled with the boom, creating a complex array of vectors. Black exhaust smoke coughed from the Cat's stack, a dark plume drifting against the blue sky, just like the Cat in the image, but intensified by effort. The engine screamed at high RPMs. The tracks churned in the mud, digging ever deeper trenches without making forward progress. Hours slipped by. The sun, which had been bright, began its slow descent towards the tree line in the background. Brad was no longer the confident engineer. He was a man at war. The clean cab was now dusty, and his face was flushed with frustration. He had applied every trick in the excavator's modern arsenal. Different teeth, different angles, using the thumb to bite and pull, using the arm to push and pry. He had pushed the machine beyond its safe operational parameters. Every hydraulic hose hummed with a tension that was almost audible. He stopped, gasping for breath, the cab's quiet air conditioning a stark contrast to the violence outside. He looked at the Sentinel. The stump looked almost identical to how it had looked in the morning, save for a few cosmetic scratches and the shallow moat he'd excavated. If anything, it seemed to be mocking him. His gaze drifted to the fence line. He noticed a beat-up old Ford pickup truck had pulled up. It was a local farmer, Old Man Jenkins, a quiet figure known more for his results than his words. He was the man in the plaid shirt seen from a distance initially, now closer. Jenkins got out of his truck, wiped his calloused hands on a rag, and just watched. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just stood and observed the modern machine's brutal, failing effort. The silence was deafening. Brad felt heat rise in his face. This was humiliation. He, with his $400,000 investment, was being beaten by a pile of old wood, with the local historian as a witness. He wouldn't be defeated. He decided to go for it. Pura bruta fuerza. He positioned the excavator with maximum track traction, bucket under the largest taproot he could reach. He wasn't just going to push it, he was going to try to tear it from the earth by using the full lifting capacity of the boom while simultaneously pulling back with the tracks. He revved the engine to its maximum RPMs. He locked the tracks. He threw all the hydraulic force he could into the bucket, and boom! The sounds were terrible. The machine groaned with the metallic scream of materials pushed to their limits. A deep, agonizing groan answered from the earth as the soil shifted. Black smoke belched from the exhaust like a mortally wounded animal. The tracks spun furiously, grinding the mud into a fine spray. Brad could feel the excavator vibrating violently. He was practically vibrating with it, his vision shaking from the tension. And then it happened. Not the satisfying crack of wood, but the sickening, high-pitched snap of metal. A split second later, a fountain of pressurized, hot red hydraulic fluid burst from a main line near the boom pivot, spraying across the excavator's pristine cab and into the engine compartment. The engine died instantly. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The rich, powerful rumble was replaced by the slow, painful hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid and steam. The entire left side of the Cat 320 was coated in a dark crimson slick. Brad sat, frozen in the driver's seat. He looked out the newly coated windshield at the Sentinel. The ancient Stump sat undisturbed. His gaze drifted back to the fence line. Jenkins was already walking back to his truck. He didn't even look over his shoulder. He'd seen enough. The Cascade Mountains still stood in the distance, a blue-gray haze. Brad Larson, the modern man of progress, was alone with his $400,000 pile of broken steel and his broken pride, and the local legend that had claimed another victim. Part 1 ends with Brad looking blankly at his broken machine in the fading light. The morning air hung heavy and damp over Pine Creek Ranch, carrying the unmistakable acrid scent of spilled hydraulic fluid. Brad Larson stood beside the crippled carcass of his Caterpillar 320, a cup of lukewarm diner coffee clutched in his hands. The neon-orange paint of the excavator was streaked with dirt and dark, congealing oil. A specialized mechanic from Seattle wasn't going to be able to make it out until Thursday, and the quoted price for the emergency field repair had made Brad physically wince. Down in the low field, the Sentinel sat exactly where it always had, an immovable monument to Brad's arrogance. The deep trenches he had violently carved around it the day before were now filling with murky rainwater. He kicked a clump of clay, a bitter taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with the cheap coffee. He was a man who believed in the absolute superiority of modern engineering. Horsepower, hydraulic pressure, and computer-assisted controls were supposed to conquer nature. Yet nature was currently winning. A low, rhythmic, mechanical thudding broke the morning silence. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a modern turbo diesel. It was a slow, guttural chug-chug-chug that seemed to vibrate through the soles of Brad's boots before it reached his ears. Brad turned toward the gravel access road. Crawling through the mist was a machine that looked like it had been resurrected from a museum. It was an antique Caterpillar crawler tractor, likely from the early 1930s. Its metal surfaces were a patchwork of faded yellow paint, bare steel, and deep, blooming rust. It had no enclosed cab, no sleek lines, and certainly no climate control. The operator sat exposed on a metal spring seat behind a massive, open engine block and a towering exhaust stack that rhythmically puffed rings of thick, black smoke. At the controls was Old Man Jenkins. He wore the same faded plaid shirt and grease-stained denim jacket he'd had on the day before. He steered the rattling beast with two vertical steel levers, guiding the steel-cleated tracks over the ruts with a slow, deliberate grace. Jenkins pulled the ancient crawler to a halt a few yards from the bleeding, modern excavator. He pulled back on the throttle, bringing the loud engine down to a steady, rhythmic idle that sounded like a giant heartbeat. He climbed down stiffly from the metal platform, holding a battered thermos. "Morning," Jenkins said, his voice raspy but calm. He took a slow sip from the thermos cup, his eyes casually sweeping over the broken hydraulic lines of the Cat 320. "Looks like you pushed her a bit too hard." Brad bristled, his defensiveness flaring. "It's a defective line, a factory flaw. The pressure spiked when that cursed stump wouldn't give. Jenkins chuckled, a dry sound like leaves scraping on gravel. Ain't no factory flaw, son. You tried to fight the earth instead of working with it. That stump's got a taproot the size of a telephone pole going straight down into the bedrock, and lateral roots spread out 50 feet in every direction. You try to just yank it straight up, the earth is going to win every time. Brad crossed his arms, staring at the rusty relic idling behind the old farmer. And I suppose you think that antique is going to do what 22 tons of modern hydraulics couldn't. I don't think, Jenkins said mildly. I know. It ain't about how much horsepower you got on a spec sheet. It's about leverage. It's about knowing where the fulcrum is. Tell you what, I'll pull that stump for you. Brad let out a cynical laugh. With that? That thing belongs in a scrapyard, Jenkins. It's got what, 50 horsepower? My excavator has nearly 200. 54 drawbar horsepower to be exact, Jenkins corrected, patting the cold iron of the crawler's side panel. But she's geared low, and she pulls from the ground up. I'll make you a deal, city boy. If I pull the Sentinel, you buy me the biggest ribeye steak at the Timberline Diner tonight, and you look me in the eye and admit that sometimes the old ways still hold water. Brad looked from the impossible stump to the confident old man, then at his own broken, bleeding machine. Desperation mingled with a lingering skepticism. He had nothing left to lose except the price of a dinner. Fine, Brad snapped. You pull it, I'll buy you a steak. Hell, I'll buy you the whole cow. But when that thing snaps an axle, don't ask me to tow it out. Jenkins just smiled. He turned back to the 1930s crawler and climbed onto the operator's deck. The old farmer didn't immediately attack the stump. Instead, he spent the next 45 minutes doing what Brad considered to be a waste of time. Using the crawler's simple, cable-operated front blade, Jenkins began to meticulously push dirt back into some of the trenches Brad had dug. He leveled the ground 50 feet away from the stump, creating a perfectly flat, compacted runway of earth. Then, Jenkins shut the crawler down. The sudden silence was startling. He walked to the back of the machine and began dragging out heavy logging chains. These weren't standard tow chains. They were massive, forged steel links, rusted brown but thick as a man's wrist. Brad watched, intrigued despite himself, as Jenkins waded into the mud around the Sentinel. The old man didn't wrap the chain around the top of the stump where Brad had been grabbing it. Instead, he took a heavy steel digging bar and cleared away the clay from a specific thick lateral root on the far side of the stump, the side opposite to where the crawler was parked. Jenkins fed the heavy chain under that specific root, locking it back on itself with a massive slip hook. He then ran the chain over the top of the stump, using the high crown of the wood as a natural pulley block. He dragged the bitter end of the chain out to the crawler's drawbar, hooking it securely. "What are you doing?" Brad finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "You're pulling from the wrong side. You're going to pull it into yourself." "I'm not trying to drag it out horizontally," Jenkins explained, wiping mud from his hands. "I'm rolling it. By chaining the far root and running the line over the top, the crawler's forward pull is converted into upward rotational force. We're using the stump's own diameter as a lever against its taproot. Physics, son. Archimedes said, 'Give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world.' Well, we're going to move the Sentinel." Jenkins walked back to the crawler. Starting the antique was a ritual in itself. It didn't have an electric starter. Jenkins first had to start a small, 2-cylinder gasoline pony motor mounted on the side of the main block. He wrapped a rope around the pony motor's flywheel and yanked. It sputtered, coughed, and caught, buzzing like an angry hornet. Jenkins then engaged a clutch, using the spinning pony motor to slowly turn over the massive, cold pistons of the main diesel engine. For a full minute, there was nothing but the mechanical whine and the smell of raw fuel. Then Jenkins threw the compression release lever. Bang! Chug! Bang! Chug! 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 The main diesel engine fired, violently shaking the entire tractor. A massive plume of soot-black smoke shot straight up from the exhaust stack. The slow, deep rhythm returned, vibrating the muddy ground under Brad's feet. Jenkins engaged the main clutch. He didn't rev the engine. He kept it at a steady, low RPM. He pulled the steering clutches, maneuvering the crawler to the very end of the compacted runway he had built. He dropped the transmission into its lowest gear, a gear designed not for speed, but for pure, unstoppable torque. The tracks began to turn. They were slow, painfully slow. The massive steel cleats bit deep into the compacted clay, locking the machine to the earth. The heavy logging chain lifted from the mud, pulling taut. It went rigid, humming like a plucked bass string. Brad held his breath. He expected the crawler to stall, or for the tracks to spin helplessly in the mud as his excavator had done, but the crawler didn't spin. The engine's note deepened to a throaty, guttural roar under the immense load, black smoke pouring steadily from the stack, but the RPMs didn't drop. The machine simply leaned into the harness. The front idler wheels lifted an inch off the ground as the full weight of the tractor was transferred into the pulling force. 50 feet away, the Sentinel groaned. It was a deep, subterranean sound, like the earth itself was clearing its throat. "Come on, old girl," Jenkins muttered over the roar of the diesel, his hands firm on the levers. Brad watched in stunned silence. The chain, acting as a lever over the top of the stump, was pulling the far root upward and toward the crawler. The physics were undeniable. Instead of trying to rip the entire massive root ball straight up against the suction of the mud, Jenkins was effectively peeling it out of the ground. Crack! A sound like a rifle shot echoed across the valley. It wasn't metal breaking this time. It was the sound of a century-old taproot finally snapping under the relentless multiplied torque. The stump shuddered. The earth around the base began to heave and crack, opening up deep fissures in the clay. The crawler marched forward, inch by agonizing inch, the steel tracks packing the earth down as they went. With a wet, massive, sucking sound, the ground yielded. The far side of the stump lifted higher, tearing free from the clay. The entire root ball, a terrifying tangle of wood and earth the size of a minivan, rolled forward, exposing the dark, gaping crater beneath it. Jenkins depressed the clutch, bringing the crawler to a halt. He let the engine idle down to its resting heartbeat. The massive logging chain went slack, dropping into the mud. The Sentinel was out. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rhythmic chugging of the 1930s diesel and the distant call of a hawk. A few ranch hands from the neighboring property, who had wandered over to the fence line to watch the spectacle, let out a low whistle of appreciation before quietly heading back to their trucks. Jenkins climbed down from the tractor. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply walked over to the massive, uprooted stump, inspected the snapped taproot, and began unhooking the heavy slip hook. Brad walked over slowly, his boots sinking into the soft earth near the crater. He looked at the massive cavern left behind, then at the tangled mass of roots that had defeated his $400,000 machine. He traced the line of the heavy logging chain with his eyes, truly understanding the sheer genius of the simple, geometric setup. He walked over to Jenkins, who was coiling the heavy chain over his shoulder. Brad started, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Jenkins. I thought I could buy my way through this land with horsepower and computer chips. I was arrogant. I was wrong." Jenkins paused, looking at the younger man from under the brim of his weathered cap. The hard lines around his eyes softened slightly. "Land doesn't care about your bank account, son, and it doesn't care about your computers. It only respects patience and folks who take the time to figure out how it's put together." Brad nodded slowly, looking past Jenkins to the rust-covered, smoking crawler that had just achieved the impossible. "That is one hell of a machine." "She's an old girl," Jenkins said, patting the cold iron of the blade arm. "But she knows how to dig her heels in. Built back when they made things heavy, and they made things simple." "Ribeye," Brad said softly. "The biggest one they have, and drinks are on me, all night." Jenkins smiled, a genuine warm expression. "I'll hold you to that, Brad. But first, let's get my chain unhooked. I got chores to do before sundown." Hours later, the sun had fully set behind the Cascades, casting long shadows across Pine Creek Ranch. Brad Larson sat in a vinyl booth at the Timberline Diner, a half-eaten steak on the plate in front of him. Across the table, Old Man Jenkins was working methodically through his own meal, a glass of dark beer sweating next to his plate. Outside the diner's window, illuminated by the flickering neon sign, sat a flatbed tow truck. Strapped securely to the bed was Brad's bleeding, broken Caterpillar 320 excavator, waiting for its expensive trip back to the city for repairs. Brad looked at his machine. He didn't feel the sting of humiliation anymore. Instead, he felt a profound sense of perspective. He had come to the country thinking he was the master of his environment, armed with the latest technology. He had learned, the hard way, that true mastery wasn't about imposing your will through sheer force. It was about understanding the mechanics of nature, respecting the history of the soil, and knowing that sometimes a rusty piece of iron and a lifetime of hard-won knowledge could move mountains, or at least the most stubborn stumps in the valley. He raised his beer glass toward the old farmer. Jenkins met his eye, raised his own glass in silent acknowledgement, and took a drink. Tomorrow Brad would start fixing his machine, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that the next time he faced an impossible problem on the ranch, he wouldn't reach for the throttle first. He would reach for a shovel, take a step back, and look for the leverage.